Well, hello friends, and welcome to another Ask Zach. Today we're going to talk about Vox amps. I've been wanting to do this for a long time, and I finally have a Vox amp that I love, and it's taken me a long time, and so I wanted to talk about that and tell you how I found, what I think is the ideal Vox circuit. And okay, I'll just go ahead and say it. It's a 1964 Vox AC10, and I got it from Dan Strain, and it's got a cool story about the restoration and the people involved in it. And so I'm going to talk a bit about that, kind of my journey towards how I love Vox amps. Yes, I'm a deluxe reverb guy, but also have a great affinity for Vox amps. And yeah, so just a little bit about Vox, a little history about the AC10 and the significance of it and why it's such a really cool circuit. All right. So while you're thinking about it, well, if you've been enjoying the show and you haven't subscribed yet, we'll go down in the corner. And then if you've already subscribed, and then I'd really appreciate you supporting the show. And you can, there's tip jar information in the description of the video. There's also at AskZach.com, you can find friends of Ask Zach for those of you that have asked about supporting the show on a monthly basis. We also have merch, and this is actually a new design. And so this is a nice circuit, and then it has the little Ask Zach logo down here, and it says Guitar Tech, Guitar Talk. So that's a lot of fun. So, all right, back to the video. So I think like most people, I became aware of Vox because of the Beatles. So I think, who's been photographed or videoed more, filmed more with Vox equipment than the Beatles? I mean, they were huge Vox supporters, and Vox, of course, supported them all through their careers, pretty much up until the end when they started playing, Fender stuff, because, Vox had changed hands and things had kind of gone downhill with them. But, yeah, it kind of starts with the Beatles. Then, and one of the funny things about the Beatles is that, we really think of the AC30 as being the Beatle amp. But it was only the Beatle amp for a short period of time. In fact, by December of 1963, they had stopped using AC30s. In fact, the only one that they had, they used one for the Vox Continental organ that John Lennon would play some that was kind of on really far stage left. And, in some of the footage, you'll see, where John Lennon will go over, and usually he's hamming around, and there's a top boost AC30 behind him that the Continental was plugged into. But meanwhile, they had already moved on to, by the time they came to the States, they were already using AC50s, and then they were using AC100s, and, and different variations of that. Then there's the John Lennon, song that he's singing lead vocal on, It's Only Love, has that, guitar line that sounds like the Vibravox circuit, which that probably meant that was probably an AC30 because, of course, the bigger amps didn't have that circuit in it. So probably an AC30. But, yeah. So you have the Beatles. Then probably one of the examples that I also saw was Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. I remember, seeing Mike Campbell, and he was playing his Broadcaster. That's a real interesting guitar, and they had this wall of Super Beatle amps, and I can't remember what TV show it was, but anyway, they played, something, And it was very, Beatle-y. And then he played this solo that was very kind of Southern rock sounding, this. He played that kind of thing. And I was like, yeah, I like that. It was it was twangy and jangly, and you know, bridge pickup Telecaster through a Vox amp. Or, of course, probably in the recording of it might have been a Tweed Deluxe or something like that. But at least on that TV show, they were using the Super Beatles. Then the next thing that really hit me hard was seeing John Jorgensen play with the Desert Rose Band. And he had two AC30s, and I remember seeing him on Austin City Limits and other television shows. And, you know, and he had that, again, the Telecaster thing, or G&L ASAT, and, you know, that real ringy, you know, thing that... Yeah, there's just something about a Vox, and you put a Tele in front of a Vox, and it just has this really twangy, jangly, wonderful tone. So I heard those things, and I thought, well, that's the sound I want. I want a Vox amp. Well, I ended up, you know, of course, coming to Nashville. I met, you know, of course, I was in college with Brad Paisley, and he already had AC30s, and it was kind of like, well, that's his thing. I need to find something else. And so I used, you know, mostly Fender and Music Man amps all through kind of the 90s. And then finally I just decided, you know, I'm going to get a Vox amp. So Korg, you know, had, you know, of course, Vox is just a name. And so Korg was the Marshall factory was making Vox amps in the 90s. And they had those, you know, nice reissues. And they had gotten Celestion to start making the Blue speaker again. And those are some good amps, but I bought one and it was a lemon. And nothing against Vox, but this amp, you know, I had it worked on 6 times in a year. I had it fail on me during shows. I had to play through a bass amp for a gig because it went out, and finally I just ended up, you know, dumping it. You know, I traded it in for like $500 at a Guitar Center in Houston. And, you know, which was horrible because I had paid close to $2,000 for it. And I was just kind of heartbroken. So I used, you know, some Dr. Z amps, and those are great. But it was like I always wanted I wanted a Vox. I wanted the Vox sound. I wanted to have that in my, you know, kind of arsenal of tones. So probably 5 years ago, I tried again. And I got one of the Korg, you know, British-made AC15s. That is, you know, it's not like a JMI AC15. It's kind of like a top boost AC15 kind of thing, you know. And it was good, but it still didn't have the sound that I wanted to hear, and it didn't sound like an old amp at all. Because of course I had heard those working with Brad. He had a bunch of, you know, JMI AC30s. He had, you know, a bunch of them that had add-on top boost, and then of course later on he got an AC15, you know, vintage one, and so I was just, you know, it's not the sound. So I just decided, well, I'm just a Fender guy. I'm going to keep playing through my Deluxe Reverb and my Harvard, and that's going to be it. I'm just not going to care about the Vox thing. I'm just not going to do it. So then a couple of months ago, you know, of course, I've been friends with Dan Strain, or Danocaster, for, you know, a number of years, and I always noticed he had 2 Vox amps at his house, and I didn't know what they were, and I didn't really care. And finally, you know, he said, you know, I've got 2, you know, vintage Vox AC10s, and one of them's stock, and the other one's in kind of a different, you know, cabinet. It's not original. He said, you know, really, I'm thinking about selling that one. And I was kind of curious. Then I was like, nah. And then it just kind of kept bugging me. And so then I was asking him about it, and he said, you know, I used to own 3 vintage AC30s. And he said they sound amazing, but they were all just too loud to record with, you know. And he said, when I found these AC10s, they were really perfect because they're the right volume. They kind of hit the sweet spot at the right volume level. And he said, I got rid of all my AC30s because I love these AC10s so much. And then of course, he got to the point where he wanted to sell one of them, the one that had the, kind of crazy big cab. And I'll post a picture of that. But, yeah, so finally I decided, okay, well, can I borrow it for a couple of days? And he said, sure. So I went and got it and had it here and started playing through it. And I just fell in love with the sound of it. I was like, this is the Vox sound that I've always wanted to have for my arsenal, for my, my Harvard Deluxe Reverb Vox AC10. So we made a deal, and he was very kind to me. And yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the AC10. So it's not really as known now. It's known a little more now because Vox has done an AC10 amp that they have out now, but it is not a reissue of the original AC10 or any of the iterations that were made in the 60s. So I just want to throw that out there. But also to say that the current AC10 is a great little amp, and I have tons of friends that have them and love them, and they're a great little Vox. But the original AC10 came out in 1958 and had kind of the TV front. It didn't have the split front. It had the TV front. And it was kind of still based on kind of some Univox, accordion kind of designs. It wasn't until Dick Denny got involved in 1960, and they had already, the year before, actually maybe in 58, 59, Dick Denny had already kind of gotten the AC15 dialed in, and part of it was he was using an EF86 preamp tube. So the EF86 is a very special part of the AC15, the early AC30, and the AC10. So the EF86 is the original Vox sound. That's the sound that put Vox on the map. That's the sound the Shadows used. That's what launched the company. And what happened was, of course, as crowds got bigger and they had to make bigger amps, well, they made an AC30 that had the EF86 tube in it. And what happened was that when it got in a bigger cab and was louder, it started going microphonic. So then they started chasing their tail because they had to get rid of the EF86. And the EF86 is a very special, cool tube, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So, because everyone was, because once they took it out and they just put a 12AX7 in there, they're like, where did the sound go? So that's when they developed the top boost circuit, because it was all about Dick Denny and Underwood and the other guys at Vox trying to get the EF86 sound, but without that tube and at a higher volume. Well, the great thing is, and the great thing about this amp is, the AC15 and the AC10 never lost the EF86. So, all the classic, JMI AC15s and AC10s have the coveted EF86 circuit. So in kind of the original, not completely original, but in the early lineup, you had the AC15 as the top of the line before the AC30 came out. Now, if you really want to dive deep into this, I suggest you watch Keith Williams' Vox AC30 video, 5-Watt World, or you get, Vox the JMI Years, which is an $80 coffee table book that's this big, and I own it. It's an amazing book, and it's, even though it's $80, I'll say it's absolutely worth it. But if you really want to dive deep, but so the top of the line at that point was the AC15. And then they had also created the AC4, which was the little practice amp. Well, they decided they needed an amp that was in the middle of those two. So what they did was, where the AC15 had the Vibravox circuit, and the Vibravox was kind of this phasey, tremolo, vibrato kind of sound that used quite a bit of circuitry and at least 2 tubes. They took that out. So they took that out of the AC15 circuit, and they used just a regular tremolo circuit that used, the bias variety where it's biasing the tube, and they put that in there. And then instead of having a 12-inch speaker, they gave it a 10-inch speaker, And then they found that the amps were still too close. And so what they did was the inputs on the AC15 had 68K resistors. Okay. Well, they took the resistors up to 220. And what that did was it padded the input. And so it made the AC10 and the AC15 more different in volume. So basically they kind of cut off its legs, but the legs were still there. So, of course, this is fast forwarding a bit, but what everybody found out was you could take those AC10s and you could put, the 68K resistors on there, and all of a sudden the amp would be quite a bit louder and brighter and have more life to it. And all of a sudden it sounded pretty much like an AC15. So, yeah, so the AC15 was, the AC10, I should say, the AC10 was that middle ground between the AC4 and the AC15. And so kind of the classic lineup of, of the classic, tube layout, like from 60 until, let's say, 67, 65, 67, around in there when they kind of went under, was this. So it had a EZ81 rectifier, which kind of looks more like an EL84. It's kind of a skinny guy. Then you had two EL84 power tubes, just like an AC15. Then you had a ECC83 or 12X7, which was the phase inverter. Okay. Then you had an ECF82, which this was like part of the preamp and part of the oscillator, for the for the tremolo. And that's kind of a really interesting tube because it's kind of part EF86 and it's kind of part 12X7, and it's kind of a rare tube. So then you of course had the EF86, which of course was a preamp. And what makes the EF86 so different than a 12X7 is a 12X7 has an amplification factor of 100. Okay, so it's the highest of its type. So like a 5751 has a lower amplification rating, or a 12AU7. So the 12AX7 is 100. Well, the EF86 is 185. So it's almost double the power, and so it can do a lot more, and it basically functions almost like two 12AX7s. And it also has a much better input as far as being able to take higher level signals, whether it's from a loud, high output guitar or from pedals. So it deals better with that, has a greater dynamic range. And then as far as just its tonal characteristics, I would say it kind of has a really assertive mid-range, maybe a little bit, ringy, jangly kind of thing. So that's kind of the layout of the AC10. So then, and the amp again was originally a 110 amp, but then it soon became a 210 amp, and it was called the AC10 Twin. And so that's what this amp originally was. So this amp originally was an AC10 Twin. And I don't know what happened to it, but it got this really strange, big, heavy cabinet. And it was, like close to the size of like a super reverb cab, and it was made out of MDF. And if you don't know what MDF is, it's basically sawdust and glue, and it's heavy. And it's not known for like resonance or anything, but even in that, the amp sounded incredible. So with that, and I have to say one or two other things about, this amp. So it had a replaced transformer. So, and because, the original cab was gone, a transformer was replaced, and it was with a nice one. It's got a Mercury Magnets, transformer tone clone in there. And it still sounded so great, but with that, I just decided, you know what? I'd rather have a smaller cab for it. So I started, kind of looking around, and then I remembered that I had seen a video by Vintage Wood Workshop, and where Kyle Bollendorf had made a new cab for a Silverface Deluxe Reverb, a 68 one. And I really enjoyed the video, and his work was just amazing. And so I reached out to him and I said, Kyle, would you be willing to make a cab for this 1964 AC10? It's got this huge MDF thing, and I really want to do that. And he agreed to it. He said, in fact, you do your video and I'll do mine, and we'll and that way people can you can talk about it, and then people can actually see the cabinet being made. So we had this. Well, Kyle of course made it, but this is Baltic birch, like an old one, and we went for the earlier style cabinet, which was thinner. So they later made them thicker, and they have like the plastic corners on them. But the earlier amps, they're like 60, 61, 62, even into 63. They're thinner. The wood of the cabinet is thinner, and so I wanted to do that partially for weight and partially for resonance. So, and we stuck with the exact same dimensions as a AC10 twin. Now we did have to modify it a bit in that we had to bring this part of the panel up a little bit so that we could fit a 12-inch speaker in here, because I didn't want to do the two 10s, because the amp already had a 12 in it in that big MDF cab. It had a great Celestion Blue in it, and the amp just sounded so great. I was like, well, I'm not going to mess with this. Let's put a 12 in there. So he did that. He and so there's, so you can watch the video and see how it all comes together. We put brass vents on it, and got the from North Coast Music, got all the the Vox parts, and no one makes smooth the smooth vinyl kind of Levant that was on those early black AC30s, and so I went with Marshall covering, but so. And then I guess a little side note is that the guy that did the work on this amp when Dan got it was Paul Cochran of Timmy pedal fame. So so it's had some good hands have been on this. But I'm blown away by the cabinet and the work that Kyle did. And here I'm just going to play a little bit, and I'm using, of course, the EF86 channel, and the only effect I'm using a touch of plate reverb off a Boss RV2. So, you have this kind of thing. So you can hear it's just got that Vox thing. It's got this wonderful compression to it. It's got this barkiness. It's just got a lot of wonderful character to it. And that's the EF86 channel. So I'm going to move it over to the normal channel, which has a 12AX7. Also great, but there is just something about the EF86 just has a little bit more character. It has a little bit more mid-range, and also it has the tremolo. So here. Really, really great. And again, I'm just using a reverb pedal. That's the only thing I'm using, and just a touch of verb. It just has an amazing sound. So, yeah. So I think this is the greatest design that Vox really ever did. And, you know, the vintage Vox AC10s are out there. And they're not cheap, but they're not crazy expensive. You know, depending on how original they are, they're kind of in the $3,000 to $4,000 range, which, no, it's not cheap, but that's still in the range of a lot of boutique amps. And, you know, these amps are just really, really cool. And the one thing I would do is, is have the input resistors change from 220 to 68K. And then it's just, you know, a lot of them come with the ELAC, you know, speakers, which they're hard to find anyone that can recone those things. And so you might want to put some other speakers in that. Or if you're lucky, like me, maybe you can find one that's in really bad shape and doesn't have the original cab, and you can have a nice 112 cab made for it and put a Celestion Blue, because I think that's really the ideal situation. Because what you end up with, what I have here, is basically an AC15, except instead of the Vibravox circuit, which I don't care for at all, you get a great tremolo, which for me is so much more usable. So for me, this is the ideal amp. It's also a little lighter. It has less tubes in it than an AC15, and you know, which means less heat, and you know, tubes will last longer, yada yada yada. So, all right, well, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed this. Of course, I got a lot of help from, let's see, Keith Williams, you know, helped me out. The Vox, the JMI years was very helpful, and of course, thank you to Kyle Bollendorf for the amazing cab that he built, and I hope you will watch his video on the making of the cab. All right, see you next time. Bye-bye.